Thank you, Brett, so much for finding time for me today. I saw the film a few weeks ago in our screening room here in London. I was completely blown away. From the second it started, I've been listening to David Bowie since I was 5 years old. I know a lot of his music and I've seen all the films and everything, but what you did was make me see and hear Bowie completely afresh. And I didn't think that was possible, but the way you wove all that material together was just phenomenal.
Well, I'll tell you something, and this may sound peculiar to many, but you basically are describing my response seeing the film Wednesday night, the last night it was shown in IMAX, and probably my 60th time seeing it theatrically.
Why does it still trigger that response in you?
It was such a difficult film to wrangle and post with the color grading and the sound. And I don't believe the film existed until we married the two. The offline edit of the film wasn't the film because the film was designed as an experience, and the experience could only happen once the sound mix and the color were married together. So the first time I experienced the film was not when I picture locked. It was in April of this year. And the fact is, every cinema presents the film in a slightly different manner. That's even true in IMAX. And so I'm always curious to see how it's going to look and how it's going to sound. And some screenings are more satisfying than others. And Tuesday was the last time the film was going to be presented in IMAX anywhere in the world. And I just went to a public screening, bought a ticket, and was overwhelmed that, 14 weeks after we opened, I was sitting in a relatively full cinema on a Tuesday night with audiences who were, not knowing I was in the room, applauding after songs, and it looked better than I'd ever seen it look. I figured maybe they just changed the bulb for Avatar or something, and it was like a great room for sound, and I just was so happy, man, just so happy to spend another moment. And it's a really densely layered film, and I'm still coming to terms with understanding some of my choices and decisions. Many of which in the moment were meant to feel sort of spontaneous. And I mean, we could get into this as another subject, but in creating something that was so intuitive, it's really taken me some time to grasp and oftentimes find meanings in things that I'm discovering new meanings myself and new avenues of interpretation.
I think the real joy of this film is that it is an experience and it is an art piece. And it sounds like a really obvious question given what you've just said, but most biopics will take a very linear trajectory: birth, death, event, talking head. Why did you ultimately want to take this more artistic approach?
I don't, nor would I ever dare compare myself and my work to Bowie's, who is on such a elevated creative and artistic plane. But there are a couple areas that I think David and I overlap in terms of how we've approached our careers. I have tried to make each film a challenge and an adventure for myself, and have tried my best to make each film kind of the continuity of my work is each film is kind of made in the spirit of the subject, but each subject is so diverse that, a Cobain film looks nothing like the kid stays in the picture. And so I think that idea was something that really synchronized with David and I. And so the idea, when I arrived at Bowie, I never for 1 second contemplated bringing in interviews, because it's not something I do. And I prefer to allow the subjects to present their own story. And in that sense, it's almost a primary source. But I think specifically with Moonage, and something that I've recently discovered from a conversation I had with David's estate, was David spoke to his executor before he passed and expressed his desire not to participate in a talking head documentary. And what was communicated to me was that David felt that in documentaries with expert testimony, the experts become the facts. And that defines the history. And he was resistant to that. So I think the format was something that he actually desired himself, but was also something that I wanted to pursue, not knowing that that was his stated purpose.
I think part of that is the success of your film is due to the fact that, like Bowie himself, you project, as a fan, you project your own meaning onto it.
So,
and like any great art, you take from it what you see and you bring your own stories to it. And, if you listen to Bowie's songs, they're not always linear. They sometimes don't necessarily make sense, but there are aspects of it that you can relate to, and different people relate to different things. So I think there's a definite correlation there.
I would say that's true of almost every Bowie song. Trying to extract what his intent was from our interpretation is quite a elusive challenge when it comes to Bowie. And while all art invites us to kind of project onto it, not all art is created with that intent. When I created The Kid Stays in the Picture, this was not something I thought about. When I arrived at Bowie, I tried to incorporate as many of his ideas and strategies and approaches to constructing art. And Bowie was really conscious of the relationship between spectator and artist, and inviting a kind of participatory experience and inviting us to project. He talks about that during the Ziggy section of the film. In one of my favorite interviews with Mick Rock from 1972, right before the album came out, Ziggy Stardust came out, Mick was talking to David, and he said, "So I understand there's this Ziggy Stardust album coming out. It's like a space age sort of concept album." And David said, "Oh, no, man, I just mentioned space and moonbeams in like 1 or 2 songs. The audience is going to fill in the blanks." And I think even with the cut-up process, he discusses in the film how it invited him to kind of project and conjure up interpretations and meanings. So Moonage Daydream was created with this in mind. It's not, I'd like to say, about David Jones. It's about Bowie in quotations. And ultimately, it's designed to invite the audience to project and reflect their own experiences on the screen. And I think the omission of talking heads and facts create an environment that's really conducive for projection. If Bowie's songs were really literal, and specific, they wouldn't give us that opportunity to project in the same way that they do. So it was important that the film take on that relationship with the viewer.
When I was thinking about the questions I wanted to ask you, I started thinking about sculpture, because I think what you did with the vast amount of material that you had at your disposal, it is like sculpture. And I was thinking about the Henry Moore And he said that a work can have in it a pent-up energy, an intense life of its own, independent of the subject that it may represent. So in a sense, your film almost transcends Bowie. How do you feel about that statement?
Well, short of the fact that nothing transcends Bowie, as far as I'm concerned, but as a concept, I think it's very true. I think that it's applicable to this film. It speaks to what I was telling you, how I see something new and different in the film every time I sort of look at it, and I'm the progenitor. I got to be careful how I say this, because I don't mean to place myself as the sort of in the hero's journey, but the environment that this film was created is really unlike anything I've ever heard or experienced myself, in the way that I was working autonomously, without a crew, without any supervision, without any input from producers or studio or editors or anyone. That's not how films are made. And I think that process really aided the kind of organic nature of the art, that it is an art piece. I've never created one before. I think of all my work prior to this as being incredibly methodical. I never thought of myself as an artist in any way, shape, or form, more of an engineer. And I feel that David kind of invited me to let go and to really dig in. And I think one of the great outcomes of this whole experience for me has been the way that audiences went along on this journey, this very unorthodox film. I mean, it was an arts and crafts project. There's no other way to say it. It was one, it was like, sitting in my room by myself, playing around with these incredible archives, and from that came something that it's sort of magical.
With the huge amount of material that you had to start with, was it a case of when you were ingesting all this material, putting it in the timeline, lining it all up in the Avid, was it like chipping away until the jewel was?
Not at all. No, there was no assembly edit per se. The film just rolled forward. And of course, when it was in its final place, I went back and tweaked things, but it was really like a puzzle. And I couldn't do, but unlike a jigsaw puzzle where you can work on different sections at different times, I had this script when I went into the edit room. So I wasn't trying to find the movie in the edit room, but I didn't have the shots in the script per se. And figuring out how to get moment to moment in the film was a bit traumatic at times, because there was very few rules to choose from. If you're cutting fiction and you're trying to wonder what your next shot is, you generally have like a multicam up on the screen with 4 different shots that you can choose from. Every moment there was an opportunity to invite, one of 5 million elements onto the screen. So it was, because of the nonlinear and the kind of nature of the film and the kind of alchemy of the film, anything was possible.
And did your kind of overarching vision for the film change as you worked through that process?
I don't think my vision for what type of experience I was seeking evolved much. I mean, it really was rooted in adventures I had with movies seminal sort of cinematic experiences I had mainly in my teenage years, like seeing The Wall 5 times in a row the week it opened when I was 14. And the thing about The Wall that just struck me at that age, sort of like the French New Wave, was it was like anything goes. And you walked out theater going, like, what did I just see? Same way I felt with Fantasia, and same way I felt when I saw Repo Man opening night, the Alex Cox film, which, if you know that film, imagine walking in totally cold, no idea what you're going to see other than there's Black Flag music. And then the cars flying off at night. And like, I love that sort of adventurous cinema, that sort of works outside the lines. So that was always part of the hope, was that we would create something that was sublime and emotional at the same time. I guess the narrative of impermanence and transience was something that I wasn't aware of until I got into the research. And it was, only through, I think, the 2 years of investigation that I arrived on that as the through line. And then also this idea that the film ended up becoming a kind of life-affirming sort of roadmap to how to lead the most balanced and fulfilling life. That was not something that I was thinking about when I approached the estate, as, I didn't think there was any moral or anything that I was going to deliver. And through, but, after opening myself to David for the 2 years, that was the story that presented itself to me.
I was going to ask you about those clips actually from the movies, because it just strikes me that you spend 2 years going through the material. The Bowie estate gave you access to, I believe, over 5 million assets. Is that right?
Yes, apparently so.
And then on top of that,
actually count one by one, but that's what the staff said.
And then on top of that, you've got clips from 55 of the best movies ever made. You've got Fellini, you've got Chaplin, you've got Méliès, Hitchcock, Eisenstein, Buñuel, Riefenstahl, all of that in there. And you touched on that they were they movies that made an impression on you when you were young, or how did you pick those movies?
Well, so I started research in 2016, and at the time it was just books. And anytime David referenced an artist or a work of art, I would jot it down. And I would continue to do that over the course of the next 4 years. Whenever, sometimes some of the references I found in his journals, most of them were from interviews. And I just kept a running sort of, list. And when I went to edit, I had arrived at this idea that I would allow the sources of inspiration to coexist with his own creations in a way that kind of mirrored his reference points in his own music, and also with the understanding that when I was 13 and coming to Bowie, there were things, ideas, names he would reference. I had no idea who they were, what they were, and it would take decades before I did, but it didn't stop me from embracing the music and arriving at my own conclusions. So all of the clips that you see in the film, except for maybe a couple, very few, were all referenced by Bowie during his lifetime. And the film is an homage to those artists that influenced and inspired him. The one exception, I think, is Event Horizon, which creeps into Hello Space Boy. And I'm going to be honest, I had a friend of mine do a final pass on that scene for me, and he's the one who inserted it, and I was at my color correct, and my colorist was like, hey, so what's with the Event Horizon? I was like, what are you talking about? And he was like, this, and there'd be like a 2-frame shot of something. Yeah, anyway. But short of that, they were all, and listen, the fact is, a lot of what David inspired David were things that inspired me throughout my film life and through schooling. And, I think in particular, Nosferatu and Metropolis and Hans Christian Andersen and Joan of Arc. I mean, these were seminal films, 2001 seminal films in my sort of upbringing, as were a lot of the artists he references. And I will tell you that one of the great joys of this film was discovering or taking a deeper dive into artists who I really wasn't familiar with. And that's Bowie. I got an education in art history making this film that was really exciting and a wonderful opportunity.
Because you said that Bowie was a passport to culture. And I think one of the other great achievements of your film is you've continued that trend. Your film is like, you can imagine people going, oh, I've never heard of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I don't know about Run Lola Run. And you opened that up to people.
I'll share with you story. I had a mentor film teacher who was with me from 7th to 12th grade. His name's Jim Hosney. He ran the film studies program at the American Film Institute, and then also happened to teach at this junior high and high school I went to. And Jim is one of the great intellectuals I've ever met. And he would teach us as 13-year-olds the same curriculum he was teaching his grad MFA students at. Never dumb anything down for us. So we were seeing Godard and Kenneth Anger on film in class, 60 millimeter projectors at 13 years old, 14 years old. And Jim was a consultant for me on the film because I knew David had so many references, and some of which were foreign to me. And so I brought Jim in to kind of sort of help guide me through some of the materials. And I brought him to the premiere at Cannes, dedicated the evening to him. And one day we were sitting in the mixing stage, and we were looking at a section of the film, and I said, Jim, what's really remarkable is that you introduced me to so much culture that's now embedded in this film. And there's going to be some kid who sees this film and sees the bibliography at the end and goes and looks up Kenneth Anger. And it's just generationally passing it down one to the next and having this kind of conversation across time. And it's, one of the most beautiful, I think, results of Bowie's art and work, that he did that for so many of us. There's so many. I saw an interview with Todd Haynes recently on the Bowie channel, and I felt like I was like, wait, I've been saying the same thing for this entire year promoting the film, like verbatim. Like we both had that same sense and respect for the way that David introduced us to so much amazing culture,
Just going back to the volume of material that you had, and I mean, I don't know what your memory's like, but I can't really remember what I was doing yesterday. So how do you keep 2 years worth of that huge archive in your, what's the process? How do you actually remember, oh, there was that shot I saw 18 months ago, it needs to go in here? Or does it not work like that at all?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I actually think I have possibly one of the worst memories of anyone I know. And I am very confident that I probably have the worst memory of anyone who's ever considered themselves an editor. Because I think being an editor, it's absolutely critical that you have a tremendous ability to recall. However, even the best of the best, I think, would be challenged ingesting media for 2 years straight on a, 10 to 12 hour a day basis for 6 days a week, and then trying to remember everything that came in. I went to get a scan. I went to my doctor at some point. I thought I was had early dementia because I can remember anything. Like I would forget what I was overwhelmed with information. So while I take notes oftentimes you don't really, understand why something will be relevant until you see something further down the road. So even notes are slightly limited. And the fact is, when I finished the screening, I couldn't remember what I'd seen the first few months I'd screened. I had to go back and watch 71 to 76 again because it was so distant. I do think going back to like the kind of magic of this film is that I don't think it would have been as successful if I did have a better memory. I think that things kind of floated in and out. It was kind of like osmosis. Some stuck, some didn't. And it made it impossible to be methodical. I was myself in a bit of a fever dream. Obviously there was sort of knowing that we were trying to finish the film in IMAX. I had probably a much stronger recall on some of the visual materials that I knew were from better sources that I would build the film upon. But there are a lot of times I would rediscover. There were several times I would put something on and take notes on it, only to get like an hour and a half into it and be like, "Oh wait, I've already done this one." Like it was a lot of that. And if I had an editor working with me, I'm sure we would have caught it much earlier. But again, I'm not trying to make lemonades out of lemon. I really think it worked. Like it was incredibly helpful to create that type of film. As David says, and one of my favorite lessons from him is virtuosity is overrated. And, one way to be in the moment and to be present is to sort of just be loose and sort of a bit reckless with how sort of precious some of the stuff is, and allow yourself to constantly re-engage and feel like you're seeing material for the first time.
Talking about your personal connection growing up, I think you mentioned that you discovered him during puberty. What was there a particular track or a particular video that you were just like, he's my man?
Yeah, well, I came of age right when Ashes to Ashes had popped, and right at the advent of music television. So my entry point was Scary Monsters and the Ashes to video. And I would say that probably within a year of that time, Let's Dance came out, which I was fortunate enough to have seen at the LA Forum, the Serious Moonlight Tour. But I will say that in that short time span of that 1 year critical age of like seventh grade, 13 or whatever I was, that I knew that I felt Let's Dance was sort of a departure, if you will, creatively and artistically. I now have a much greater appreciation, but I was a bit snooty even then. About that album and that concert, which I totally love now. But yeah, that was Ashes was the entry point, and then immediately circled backwards, to Hunky Dory, which is, stayed in my rotation for 40 plus years.
As you mentioned, you were the producer, the editor, the director of the movie, and from what I understand of what you said, it sounds like a very solitary experience. How did that process shape the film?
It's very rare in our culture to have an opportunity to create art out of an iconic brand. And I say brand, and I don't mean to be cynical about it, but Bowie is a brand. at this point. And there's brand managers who oversee these things. And so, you know, most of the time you're getting a kind of filtered experience. And the fact that I had no input other than David during the pandemic, that's something that I think there were two key events that really impacted the direction of the film. The first was January 5th, 2017, right as I was about to start the screening, I suffered a heart attack and flatlined for a short while and was in a coma. And it was from that kind of perspective that I entered the work. And so I was quite open and receptive to David's teachings on how to lead a balanced life. I felt like he was speaking directly to me and telling me what I needed it. And so the film started to evolve in that way, which was quite, you know, obviously unexpected. And then the second thing was the pandemic hit. And what happened when the pandemic hit is because of my heart condition, I couldn't be around anyone until the vaccines came about. So we went from an office with 20 interns and several assistant editors to a completely empty office. I remember very clearly the day before everything shut down, my assistant going out to a supermarket and getting 60 days worth of frozen dinners. And we got a futon, moved it into my office. And my kids weren't as hunkered down as I was, and they were teenagers. So I couldn't be exposed to them again because of my heart issue. So I moved in here, and, you know, it was the world we all lived through. But I was alone with Bowie, an artist whose stock in trade is isolation and alienation and how to be creative during these, you know, periods. And so that I felt like I was creating a reflection of the world that we were all existing in. And I don't think I would have gravitated towards certain ideas without that sort of conditioning.
Let's talk about the music choices that you made. And for me, what really hooked me in was Hello, Space Boy, because I love that film. I don't hear it, and I love that song. I don't hear it enough. I've loved it since 1995. And it was such an unusual choice to kind of open the film with. And such a surprising choice, because there were certain key songs you didn't include, like Rebel Rebel or Fame or Sound and Vision or Fashion. And you did opt fairly frequently for the less of the greatest hits.
One of the great joys of doing these music films is that I've done 3 of them now, and I've had no input from music supervisors or the artists about what songs to use. Even with the Rolling Stones. And what was weird was when they toured after Crossfire Hurricane, I think they were playing with like 80 or 90% of the playlist that I had worked on. So, you know, the benefit and the advantage is I gravitate towards songs that resonate with me on some level. On Moonage Daydream, the playlist was the first piece of the script that came together. And I had arrived at this idea that the through line was transience, but I didn't know how to, and impermanence, but I didn't know how to structure it. So I decided to play a game. You one of the things with David is you realize, he has this great saying that I think borrowed from when someone once called him pretentious. He was like, of course I'm pretentious. I don't know why that's a bad word. Pretentious, the root of pretentious is pretend, to play. And I like to make art playful. Anyway, I sort of had landed on this through line, and I said, okay, I'm going to come up with this game. Let's pick 3 songs from every album going back to the 67 that relate to this through line in one way, shape, or form. It could be overt or it could be not so overt. It could be a song that was constructed through the Burroughs cut-up process, or it could be a song that sort of reflected sort of gender fluidity and sort of these other themes that were kind of offsprings of my through line. And so I did that. I did it in real time, just looked at the song titles, picked 3 that spoke to these themes, and wrote them down. And that's how the script started to come together. And I started to see ways of these sort of connections. And that also enabled me to create a playlist that some of them were hits and some of them were, oddities, if you will. It really was able to hit a balance. So I never really had a moment where I sat down and said, okay, let's make sure we have a certain number of hits and a certain number of, oddities. Space Boy, that is I can really address that one. And that's a bit of a heady conversation. So in 2007, I was invited to pitch David, to meet with David and pitch him a hybrid nonfiction film. And the meeting, we met at his office in Midtown, and almost immediately he launched, and he said, he complimented me on the film I had done called The Kid's Face in the Picture. I said, thank you very much. And then he just launched onto this vitriolic attack on a movie I just finished called Chicago 10. And it was, sort of criticism that no one really does to your face. And he was doing it in an absolutely gentleman-like manner. He wasn't agitated. He was like, oh, I had the opportunity to see your film Chicago 10. It was dreadful. Hated it. Like, really? He's like, oh, absolutely awful. But he kept going. And at one point, his assistant was in the room, Coco, and turns to me and said, what's your favorite Bowie song? And this came right off David's attack. And I looked at him and said, well, to be totally honest, I can't say I've really appreciated anything you've done since Scary Monsters. And David looked at me and went, touche. And the reality is I hadn't been paying attention to his music since Let's Dance. I didn't even listen. I had no idea. I was just, he had sort of jabbed me. I was stung and I was immature, and I, threw it back at him. Ironically, Carlos Alomar recently told me that that's probably the reason David responded to me and I ended up doing the film, because he said David liked when people kind of would go toe to toe with him. But this wasn't toe to toe. This was just me being very childish. And when David passed, I started to go back and go through his catalog and found myself, it's very hard for me to talk about this. I loved and continue to love his work from Outside to Black Star. And it's probably my favorite Bowie music. And the guilt that I felt at that realization that I had leaned into what was like kind of the cultural critique of him was something that was really difficult, and there was never going to be an opportunity to tell him, apologize. And so, excuse me. So going into the film with this deep love and admiration for work that I knew had been predominantly overlooked, I was like, I'm going to have a very even approach, balanced approach between the 70s work and the 80s work and the more contemporary work. And so going into the project, very conscious and deliberately, I moved Hello Space Boy to the top because I wanted to kind of announce that, hey, if this isn't your Bowie music, you might want to leave. This is not just going to be a nostalgic trip. In its worst kind of, I guess the worst thing I could say is I was sort of trolling the audience, playing with their expectations. In fact, very literally, I queue up a few strands of Space Oddity. I run a piano line of Life on Mars, and you're like, oh, here we go. And then I pull it back and go into Space Boy. Not only Space Boy, the Pet Shop Boys remix of Space Boy, which was not on anyone's bingo card before they saw the film. And what's great about the Space Boy, the Pet Shop version, and again, here's something I'm happy to admit. When I grabbed that, I wasn't looking for the Pet Shop Boys remix. I went into my Avid bin, I pulled Space Boy, the first Space Boy I saw, dropped it in there. Subsequently discovered it was the Pet Shop Boys remix. I was like, oh, this is kind of perfect. I loved how they incorporated the cut-up process. I loved that it was an appropriation and a filtration, and the lyrics of the song spoke so directly to the theme of the film of chaos and fragmentation. This chaos is killing me. You cannot announce it more clearly. The fact that he was recycling Major Tom and returning to themes that he had started several decades earlier was something I also took to heart in terms of using repeated imagery and allowing the film to kind of create a kind of discourse with itself. So Space Boy worked for me on so many levels. What was really interesting was when I came back to it at the end. So the film in script form was going to spend some time with David in the studio in 97 and on stage with him on the Earthling tour and take you up through the reality tour. Those sort of areas. And I felt that after he met Amon and found his groove again, if you will, that my story had concluded, that it was just kind of at that point going to be like, look, this is another great album he did, and another great album, and Heathens, oh my God, it's even better than, Earthling and Outside. And then, oh my God, Next Day's kind of like, it was just gonna be all these great albums to all serve one point, to say he's back. And so coming full circle from the beginning of the film back to where you don't really understand the orientation of Space Boy and the idea of the film being a sort of mandala, the sort of circular thing, was like, we're coming back to Space Boy, but we're coming back to it with a vengeance. And he's now performing it. And it's powerful. And he has definitely got his, whether you like it or you don't like it, the passion and the intensity of his performance is, he's so committed that he's clearly wiped away this idea of being an entertainer from the 80s. And that particular number was something that I deliberately wanted to employ VHS elements, any dirty dubs I could find of him, we would dirty things down. I just wanted it to be a total mishmash of all these fragments that would come together to create this explosion. And even in the musical construction of that live performance, his band, they had a click track, but they every show was a little different, which is why I had to watch every performance because you just didn't know. And it turned out that my favorite performance of Space Boy was from Tel Aviv, from my 90, I want to say 97, 96, 97. But there was all that existed was a two-track a stereo from the Beta SP. And everything from our film was from stems, but I was so connected to that version that we used that and then built the song from there, started incorporating different stems from the Paris show that year. I get to the mixing stage and we didn't have enough stems for the panning effect that we had designed for the film. So I called Reeves David's musical director from the period, and said, do you have any stems? Do you think it might be possible to record a guitar track so I have something to work with in the mix? And Reeves said, we have this click track that I can send you from the birthday show. Tell me what you think from there. He sent it in. It added to the pie. I then called Mike Garson, David's pianist, and said, Mike, is there any way you can give me a piano line for Space Boy? I sent him the Tel Aviv show. He gave me an hour later, sent a file, and we in real time added that into the mix of this on the stage, compensated with some effects to give some real sonic weight to it. And I think David and Paul, the two re-recording mixers, and myself's favorite musical moment of the film.
A little birdie told me that Sean Penn, an equally incredible filmmaker, was one of the first people to see it. How did the screening go with Sean?
Well, what happened was I had just finished the film. This was in November of 2021. I've finished, meaning like sound and color completely. Well, I kept going back for 9 months after that, but it was the first time I had a DCP. And the day I got it, a friend of mine, Davis Guggenheim, who directed Inconvenient Truth, is also very good friends with U2, called me up and said, Bono's in town this weekend. He wants to screen the film. And Davis had told him what I was working on. And I was like, Davis, no one's seen the film yet. It's a little too early for that. And he said, it's Bono. I was like, okay. So I found a screening room, and it was going to just be Bono, The Edge, and their wives. And then subsequently, Eddie Vedder decided to come along, and then and Sean Penn. And I will say I was very intimidated about Sean, because not only is he one of my favorite actors, he's also one of my favorite filmmakers, and he's also someone that strikes me as being rather intense and sort of on the outside sort of intimidating, so I was a bit messed up over that one. And they show up at this screening room. It's about 120 seats, and it's the 5 of them. And I don't know them. I've never met them. Bono was so sweet when he came in. It was set a really good tone. And of course, you have this idea in your head of what audiences are going to do when you play the film, but it never, I'm going to say that was the only screening it actually happened. I've seen this film a lot, and there's been some great audiences. However, we press play. I'm in the last row, and during Space Boy kicks in, and all of them start headbanging. And my wife are in the last row, pinching ourselves, like going, "Oh my God." Like, we didn't know what the hell this film was. And when it got to all the young dudes, they were like fists in the air. And by the way, I expect after that, I was like waiting for it every other screening. I was like, why isn't anyone do? And then after Heroes, Bono turned to me and was like, what the freaking hell? Like screamed across the room. And it was just an out of body experience for me as a filmmaker to have my, these artists who have provided me with so much inspiration responding to my work in such an intimate arena. It was incredible. And when the film was over, Bono stood up. The lights came on; they were all standing up. And Bono was not just a contemporary of David's; he was a good friend. Was at his wedding with Amon, somewhat of a confidant. And Bono said, you didn't make a film about the artist. You made a film that is the artist. And more importantly, it's two artists who come together and sort of danced, for 2.5 hours. And that was, really, incredible. And Eddie, I went out to my car and Eddie was waiting for me by my car with his arms open and just threw me into his arms, whispered something in my ear that I don't want to talk about, but I'll never, forget. And we went out, they invited us out to dinner and at one of their friends' houses. And about Sean hadn't said anything. And so I spent the dinner talking to Bono and Eddie and the Edge. And about 4 hours after this film, we're sitting by this camp, by this fire pit. And Sean turns to me and said, you mind if I give you a note? And I was like, no, of course, that'd be great. What? And he goes, I've been sitting here for the last 4 hours thinking about what to tell you. And honestly, I don't know what to say. I think the film is perfect up until the last song. It used to end with a 12-minute performance of Station to Station, which is what he was referring to. So I said, Station to Station? And he said, because you need to cut it. I was like, really? Why? And he goes, you said everything you needed to say. It's gratuitous at that point. Now you got to understand, Station to Station was the first thing I edited. I personally felt it was one of the best unseen or seen, in this case unseen, David Bowie performances ever. That it was actually the reason the film should exist. And never for a second from the moment, going back to 2017, did I ever consider removing it. But in that moment, and the film was finished, it was not an easy fix. Like we had delivered everything so, but I saw him about 25 minutes later and I walked up and I said, so how serious are you, Gary? He said, listen, you go make that change and we'll go take it out to a test screening and I guarantee you my version is going to work. Sean really saved the film. He didn't realize it in that moment, but the film was long. I made the film. It's a long film. It was designed to be a long film, in part because I wasn't going to make an appetizer out of David Bowie. But it was definitely not intended to be an endurance test. And more importantly, beyond just the length and I didn't want to do obviously didn't want to do anything gratuitous in the film. And Sean was spot on. And I went to work on it the next, couple days later. And yeah, it was it's really one of these, there was so many blessings. And we're done now with our theatrical, so I can sit here at this point and say, I've screened it then. I screened it at the Cannes Film Festival, BFI in London. We opened at the Chinese and IMAX, and broke the house record there. I mean, I've had some incredible. It's like the line in Blade Runner. I've seen things and experienced things that I never thought I would see or experience in my life on this journey. But nothing has ever rivaled the excitement that of that first screening.
How did you find that sweet spot of the length of the film that you felt I've said enough, or are there certain scenes that you wish you could have included, or you had to, other than station to station, or you felt like there's so much more material, or it's just complete?
I went into it with thinking there was going to be an intermission. It's David Bowie, I wanted it to be epic. And, the documentary Lawrence of Arabia, like just this big screen, and going into it, clearly the man had a life that if anyone is going to warrant that sort of treatment, it's Bowie. And in fact, there's still remnants of that. The version of Signet Committee that ends the 70s section, if you will, was intended to be the curtain drop. He goes, I want to live, I want to live, I want to live. Dun, 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 dun. Boom. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a 15-minute intermission. And to be honest, the first part of the film up to there was the length it needed to be in order to get to the intermission. The second part of the film, as I said, I ended up recognizing when I got to Space Boy that I said what I needed to say, and it was not going to be necessary to have a intermission. But again, the idea was that this is, I screened for a few people. It was very difficult to try to get during the pandemic people to come here and see the film. And I was cognizant of the length, but I was also keenly aware that if a majority of people had reported back that the film felt short, I was going to lengthen it, because I did not want that to be the takeaway, that it felt short, that it should feel, like I said, like a meal. When we finished the film, the US distributor Neon set up a test screening at IMAX in Lincoln Square. And they showed me the questions before. And one of the questions was, is the film too short, just right, or too long? And I was like, guys, you can take that one off there. I made the film. It's long. Like I'm the first to tell you, it's a long film. And it's particularly long, I think, because you're participating, you're asked to engage with it. So it's not just a watch. I mean, 2 hours and 50 minutes is not that long by blockbuster standards. Avatar, I'm going to go see today, hopefully, is, I heard passes the 3-hour mark, as I think every Marvel film tends to these days. So, but I'm bored out of I get, those films are all way too long for me anyway, and not in a good way. So it is what it is, it's the length that it needed to be. I don't think it could have been a minute longer. And when I hear people say it's too long, I'm like, show me where to cut, because I don't see it right now. I mean, there's the whole film are moments that you could say could be exercised, because there's not, like, they're intangible. They're intangibles, so there are these like little, you probably could have removed something, but it's a house of cards. The whole thing would have collapsed, in my mind, at least.
And now you've done this extensive deep dive into David Bowie. What surprising things did you discover about him?
Well, you got to understand, everything was a revelation, because I had listened to David, but I had not studied David. I never watched interviews with him per se. You know, I never read a book about him. So I went into this as I knew his movies, I knew his music up to you know, Let's Dance. That was the extent of it. So everything was revelatory. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I had an idea about what kind of artists I might discover, but I had no idea about the man behind that mask and how his kind of philosophies on life and spirituality were so perfectly blended and mirrored, reflective of his ideas on art. And nor did I have any idea on what an extraordinary life he lived outside of his, you know, sort of overt achievements. I do think that probably the greatest achievement of David Bowie's life was his life, not his art, was the way that he, you know, as he says in the film, he set out to have the greatest adventure any person could possibly have on earth. And I think he might have pulled it off.